Hello, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Best of Pedalshift. On this edition, baby, it is cold outside. This is a rebroadcast of a portion of episode 064, Keeping Hands and Feet Warm on Bike Tour. For most people who are probably listening to the show, you're going to experience some cold weather riding at some point. For me, December is the beginning of that season. Really, November is, but December in particular. So on this episode of the show, we went through a whole bunch of different options for keeping hands and feet warm on bike tour, whether it was for your tour or your chilly commutes, whatever. There was all of that as well. One thing that I wanted to add before going into the show is that I got some subsequent follow-up from folks regarding using pogies or bar mitts, which is sort of the commercial version of that. And I think that that's a really excellent idea and something I'm actually considering doing for this coming winter, since I've got a little bit more bicycling that I'm doing in the cold weather on a regular basis. So I think I might consider doing something like that. The challenge, of course, is I've got the butterfly handlebar situation. So I'll probably share more about that on a future episode of the show. But for now, here we are, best of episode 064, plus a little bonus on a warmer weather winter touring option as well from a friend of the show. Hope you enjoy. First up, we'll do gear talk, and in gear talk, as I had mentioned, we're going to talk a little bit about keeping hands and feet warm while you are on bike tour. I know that this is a major barrier for a lot of people when it comes to cycling in even the fall sometimes, much less the winter months. So let's talk a little bit about what some procedures are. Maybe not procedures, maybe that sounds a little bit too much. Let's talk about the things that I do, at least. And I would say there's sort of three main things when it comes to keeping your hands and feet warm. I'm going to start with hands mostly because I think that's the easier thing. Number one is layers. You are definitely going to want to be thinking about layers just like you do on the rest of your body. And kind of as a subset of that, you want to keep things dry. So that means number two, you don't want to use cotton, especially if you're going to be in wetter types of situations, which we frequently are in the winter. I prefer to only use things like wicking synthetics and wool. And frankly, I prefer wool for the most part, although I have some exceptions to that. And last but not least, number three, wind chill's a real thing, and you need a way to break the wind. There's a term which escapes me at the moment, very professional of me, I know, that sort of describes that oncoming wind when you are cycling or sailing or running or whatever, that breeze that you hit. I think it's, I can't even remember what it is. Anyways, that creates wind chill. And if you're cycling at 10 or 12 miles per hour, well, you're going to be getting a wind as you break through the air that's roughly equivalent to that coming at you. And so think about all those things, back in the day, especially if you grew up in places like I grew up where wind chill was a real thing, where, you'd have that little chart. It's the temperature and then how fast the wind is. A 10 or 12 mile per hour constant breeze on you really sucks away heat. So you need to be mindful of that. In many instances, you won't have to worry about it too much. But if you're talking about really cold temperatures plus that, then that's really going to make your hands colder quicker. Likewise, if you're a little bit wet. So we'll talk a little bit about ways to get around all of that in a moment. So when I am out cycling in colder weather, I have three basic tools that I use. And I know everyone's got their own system. And I really would love to hear those of you out there who have solved this with other systems as well. But here are the three sort of tools that I use, and I'll mix these up. The first one is close to the skin, a thin base layer glove that breathes. The one that I tend to use now, actually, I'm looking around because I think I just used it today as it was starting to chill down, is a synthetic glove. It breathes. It also has inside of it coiled metal of some type, which actually creates some reflection. Think about those emergency Mylar blankets that I've talked about in the past. Kind of the same idea. There's that reflectivity back on you. I think that you can do just as well with a really simple, lightweight, very light, thin wool glove. I think Smart Wool and all those other companies make things like that, or a synthetic one that's really just a form-fitting base layer type of thing, just like, a long underwear type of material. And they make tons of them out there. You can usually get them online for anywhere from $12 to $20 or more. But I mean, it's an inexpensive first layer. So that's one that I would say is your first tool. Second tool, and that would go on top of it in many instances, because sometimes that thin base layer may be enough. It would be a medium weight warm glove. And what I use is, I think also a product by Smartwool. It's a very breathable, very nice wool, form-fitting, but relatively medium weight glove. And that will go on over that layer. Generally speaking, the thin layer that I use or that I've been using, it won't fit. You might need to go a size up. So I tend to use these two types of gloves independently of each other because I'm missing that kind of classic thin base layer. I'm going to be doing that actually as we get further on into the winter. I'll be maybe asking Santa for such things. The last thing would be a wind and waterproof outer shell. Now, it so happens that the glove that I described as my quote unquote base layer actually is wind and waterproof, but not as much as it could be. I find that it does over time allow a little water in. And also I find that it also lets a little wind in, even though it's marketed as a windproof glove. It largely is. But when you're talking about real deal temperatures and real deal wind and real deal rain, you'll want something that is, I guess I could say, real deal waterproof and real deal windproof. Think the types of gloves that you would have and use in skiing or snowboarding or any of those types of winter sports. They're often just the shell that would go on over other gloves like I've described here. And sometimes they'll even be mittens or even the lobster style, the lobster claw style, where you keep fingers together. I think those are really good, and those give you a little bit of an upgrade in terms of the overall warmth. So as I'm starting to change my glove system, I may be moving to a waterproof mitten outer shell for my kind of real deal cold weather type of stuff. I would recommend for this particular glove, this layer, to go a size larger than you normally have. I tend to like gloves that are rather form-fitting, but when it comes to going for the all three layers at once, you're not really going to get a lot of good luck out of just classic 5-finger gloves and all of these things. And also that final layer is going to have to be pretty big to get over all of those other layers. So let me start with the scenario where it's dry outside, it's not raining, and it's not too cold. It's chilly, but it's not too cold. Today was a good day here in the DC area. We were mostly in the upper 40s Fahrenheit for most of the day. Not too cold, and it was dry. What I would tend to do for that is I'd use my base layer or just even the shell only. It depends on sort of what's going on wind-wise. If you're finding that your base layer, that the air movement, the wind gets through that layer too much, then you'll want to use the shell only and just break through that wind. That's the whole point of that layer. If it's wet out but not too cold, consider using just that outer shell because it'll keep your hands dry, and that's really, really important, especially when you've got that oncoming airflow from the relative wind, I think it's called. I'm going to have to look this up. I should have looked this up before. Dry and chilly. If it is both dry out, but say colder, maybe it's getting closer to freezing, or it's in the low 40s Fahrenheit, or whatever your kind of variation on chilly is, or downright cold, then you start mixing these layers up. For that one, you might want to consider the base layer, that thin base layer on your skin, and then that medium weight glove over it. If it gets to be a little bit too windy, that oncoming air draft is too much, well, maybe you swap out the medium weight for the outer shell layer. Or if it's too cold, we'll get to that in a second, you may be going with all three. If it's wet and chilly or colder, that's when you use all three of those layers. So we're talking the base layer, which is going to be breathable. You don't want your hand to get wet. Because if it gets wet and traps that in, then you end up having a larger problem. So you want a breathable layer. Then you've got that wool layer, or at least I use a wool layer. And then for that outer layer, maybe a waterproof shell mitten or something along those lines. As I mentioned, this is not a system that in my current setup, I don't really have, but I'm intending to fix that before things get too cold around here. And I'm looking to find a good outer shell layer, because I feel like I've got a nice combination of some of these scenarios, but when it does get wet and colder, I think that I need to upgrade my system. So that base layer plus I think I'll get a new base layer, and I think I'll also get a new outer shell as well, and mix that with the wool gloves that I have. I think that'll be really good for keeping hands warm all the time. One other thing to consider, especially if you've you're out in the cold already, and maybe you've been in the tent and you're getting out, putting your hands inside cold gloves, sometimes that'll actually chill your hands down a little bit. So one tip that I've used in the past is I'll keep my gloves inside my sleeping bag with me, or otherwise find a way to get them to be warmed up first before I put my hands in them. Another thing that I think it could be helpful, of course, is those chemical hand warmers. Those work really well. Some people like them, some people don't. I'm sort of in the middle. I've got a bunch of them. I find I don't remember to bring them when I probably could use them, but I found them to be handy on a few occasions. They're really inexpensive and they're lightweight to carry around, so something to maybe throw into a bag. Especially if you know you're going to be cycling later in the evening and you've got the lights on and it's really going to chill down. May not be a bad idea to break one of those open, and if you've got room to stick them inside your gloves in between some of the layers, that might work really well. Another thing that I've read about recently, and I wish I could remember where so I could properly credit it, but sometimes when you start getting cold in the extremities of your fingers, it's not a bad idea to get the blood movement flowing a little bit better. Our bodies naturally, when it gets cold, it kind of pulls the blood into our core area to protect it, heart, brain, things like that. So what gets cold? Our toes and our fingers. So one thing you may want to consider doing is stopping your bike real quick, hop off or just sort of straddle, and then windmill your arms around a little bit. What that does is you get that, first of all, you're moving, which is really important. You're moving your arms, which when you're cycling, you're not doing as much. But you also get that added benefit. If you're really windmilling, you got the centrifugal force that will force the blood down into your fingertips a little bit. And once you start feeling that warmth, then you might be able to get going a little bit. Might help you get through the last maybe 20 minutes or so, a little bit more comfortably. I thought that was a really interesting tip, and it reminds me of my snowshoeing days. I think I've done stuff like that, although I think I remember I was moving my arms a little bit more than I do when I'm biking. So I'm going to try that out, but I think that struck me as a good idea. So that's it for the hands. I'm very curious what you all do, especially for those of you who are in super cold upper Midwest or Alaska climates where you're really getting serious winters. I'd love to know what you have as solutions for your hands. For feet are a little bit trickier, in my experience at least. I know that there are some higher end cycling shoes and things like that. So if you use specialty shoes, if you clip in, you may be more limited, you may be less limited. It just sort of depends on what's on the market. I use flat pedals. I think I've mentioned that a million times on the show. So I'm often in boots or things like that, especially if it's really sloppy, just because I'm going to be hopping off the bike and walking in it at some point. But I would say there's a few things. First of all, the same rules apply. You want to go with layers and you want to have breathability against your skin. So I've had some good luck with the Showers Pass waterproof socks, but I think that to the degree that they were good, I wish I had when I used them a breathable layer, a base layer first. So I think before I use them again, I'm going to use one of my base layer thin breathable socks first, then the waterproof socks over that. I think they'll be a little bit more comfortable when all is said and done with that. One other thing that I've done before, and it works like a charm, especially if you're the type that gets cold toes. One of the big reasons why you're going to be getting those cold toes is for the same reason why we'd use that outer shell for the hands. And you don't think about it as much, but your feet are exposed to that same wind that your hands are on the handlebar, that prevailing wind that's coming in as you're going forward. So you need to protect them from the wind chill as well. One thing that has worked really well for me in the past, and it's kind of a sort of a hack, I guess, is those little sandwich baggies, the kind that fold over. I guess you could use Ziplocs as well. I mean, whatever, but the ones that are the super cheap ones that you can get at any corner store or any place like that, put those over your toes between your shoes and your socks. So in other words, you got your outer layer of socks, throw on a baggie over your toes, roll it up. I suppose you could cinch it down with a rubber band or something like that. You don't necessarily have to, because once you slide it into your boot or your shoe, it sort of stays there pretty well. And the best part about all of that, what does it do? Kind of creates, I guess, for lack of a better word, a vapor barrier. And then you are able to get a little bit more warmth. The wind that comes into your shoe or boot is going to be broken by that little piece of plastic that's at the end of your toes. So think about that as a possible option for you as well. If you're rocking some real serious boots, you may not have to deal with this, but if you're wearing kind of a normal sneaker or shoe, this would be something that can really help you, and certainly has helped me in the past. So for feet, it's a little trickier because we have a little less flexibility in terms of what's available out there. But, of course, also, if it's really sloppy, they're going to get wet. And there's really not much that you can do about that. You can generally protect your hands pretty well, but your feet are going to get exposed directly to water. And that's the trickiest thing as well. I think that is probably the fullest extent of all the stuff that I have to share for you on keeping your hands and feet warm and dry in winter. Like I said, I'm real curious for everybody out there who's ever done any kind of winter riding. What are your solutions? What do you do? Do you have different types of ways of handling it, or certain products that you recommend? Let me know right into the show, Pedalshift at pedalshift.net, and we will be talking about this through the winter, I am sure. Next up on the show is a little bit of follow-up from past episodes. The first thing is from a friend of the show, Paul Mulvey. Hello, Paul. And he was talking about winter touring. The past episode of the Pedalshift project, I was talking about the ideas that I've had for maybe doing a tour someplace a little bit warmer in the January, February 2017 timeframe. And he recommended one that he's looking at, and that is going from Meridian, Mississippi to Atlanta, Georgia. So down that direction, for those of you unfamiliar with the Southeast United States, it's not exactly what I would call a tropical paradise in the winter. However, it's substantially warmer than what I'd be having in the DC area, and certainly further points north as well. Paul writes in and says that taking the Amtrak Crescent from Atlanta, I presume, because I think that's where he's from, to Meridian, Mississippi, and then riding back, because they've got the roll-on service, riding back through Tuscaloosa, Alabama, which is the home of Auburn. He says another school with orange, yes, and a team that has beaten my school with orange on several occasions, so we don't want to talk about that. Birmingham, which is a beautiful city I've been to, and then on to the South Gem, the Chief, I'm going to mispronounce this, Paul, the Chief Ladiga/Silver Comet Trail. That takes you all the way back into Atlanta. From Meridian to Atlanta, that's apparently 370 miles, according to Paul. And if you do that over 6 days, that's a pretty good tour. And I agree. So you're looking at about 60-mile days, roughly. You can divide out that last 10 extra miles a little bit over, depending on how your camping situation is. He also said he can hop onto the train and not have to worry about shipping bikes to and from the destinations. And I think that sounds really great. As you all know, I love using Amtrak for my use on the C&O, which is in my backyard. And I can take it out and then ride back home, or vice versa. And that's been really, really helpful. So this sounds like a great option. And I will definitely keep an eye on the weather. And that might be something that I might consider. I can also take the train from DC, and I think Paul actually mentioned this in another part of the note that he sent, where I could take the train down from DC, I think, to Atlanta, and then transfer over. I think it would actually be a relatively easy trip for me. I think it would be overnight to get down there, but that would be kind of a fun trip. So definitely something for me to think about, and thanks for sharing that, Paul. I think if you're down south or thinking about going down south sometime this winter, this might be a good tour to consider. Meridian, Mississippi to Atlanta, Georgia, while it's a little bit warmer compared to the rest of the country. Thank you for joining. You can find Pedalshift at pedalshift.net for more great bicycle touring content. You can hear the Pedalshift project through Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcast app. Opening music courtesy of Jason Kent off his self-titled album. The track is called America. Check out his band Sunfield's latest release, Mono Mono, wherever cool music is available.